Hello and welcome back to Historical Humans Reacts. Today, r/archaeology has brought us, I think, an ethical gem. Everyone loves discussing the ethics of archaeology, whether plus or minus. And this one poses a really interesting question, so I think we should just honestly jump right into it. And they ask, recommended reading on the practice of giving personal names to people exhumed from burials. So they're asking, is it ethical to give a name to a body that you were exhuming, you were excavating? And at first, my knee jerk reaction was hold up, put the brakes on until we actually read into it. And I don't know if you want to take the reins on this one, Cullum. And
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, thank you to Kelpie Cat for posting this on r/archaeology because this is something that doesn't really get talked about enough, even in the realm of things like repatriation and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So much time is focused on getting all the stuff that shouldn't be in the hands of institutions back to indigenous peoples that not enough time is talked about with what you do when you have that stuff or when you come across it in the first place, because there is always going to be a time period between when you discover it and when someone can claim it. And the question here is uh, pretty simple. You have a body of a person that you have excavated, whether it's indigenous or not, is not a part of it here, at least insofar as I'm going to jump into it. And the question as basic is, do you name it or do you give it a number designation? Because when you give someone a name, you're kind of opposing an identity. You know, I name someone Mark, you're going to have a different vision in your head of what that person is. And if I name him Alejandro,
well, in this specific instance, they basically say, "Hi, I have a question for reading recommendations. I recently read a master's thesis where the non-indigenous, I think that's an important distinction there, archaeologist gave an indigenous name to the 1,000-year-old woman whose remains were subject to the archaeological study." So my first knee jerk reaction, like I said, was bad because a non indigenous person implementing a name, like if you find a 6,000-year-old skeleton and you name it Mark, that's not an indigenous name, and it gives off a completely different impression and thought. And there have been a couple of really prominent examples of it. Usually, if they don't have a name like that or an indigenous name, they get a geographic name. And one of the most prominent Nagbra cases was the Kennewick Man, who was named after the area in which his remains were found, which are Kennewick, Washington.
yeah. The area name is usually the safest bet. I would definitely say do not do numbers, as the poster does mention, because numbers are very inhuman, and no, it seems it seems very cold and disrespectful to dig up something that used to be a person and start calling it uh, artifact 474.
I I would almost argue that your wording there could be taken in the wrong context because there are a lot of faiths and a lot of religions that believe that your body remains a part of you and remains as much as I hate to say it, maintains agency even post death.
Agency is not the worst thing in the world, Jill. Contain contain your theorism. All right, we're in the practical part of what you do.
Yeah, well, that's just it. My thesis specifically focuses on the ethics behind including indigenous voices in the research. So this is one of the instances that I would advocate for actually just speaking to the descending community, speaking to the tribe and asking their preference. It's it's one of those things to where you may not think it's a big deal to give it an indigenous name, and you might think you're doing it a favor and you're humanizing the remains, but it could be that the tribe or that the descending community may not care, or maybe they have a different process, a different name in which they do call the remains. It's all about just trying to make sure you're staying true to the group you're trying to represent.
Yeah, and I would say I definitely viewed a lot of this naming stuff sort of as an interim process. This is from the point where you find the remains to the point where you find out who they belong to, because you should, in my opinion, you should always be consulting with the people that the remains belong to, if for no other reason than one, it's their ancestor, and two, they probably know a hell of a lot more about why it's there than you ever would otherwise.
Yeah, and per United States law, it is illegal to excavate human remains, whether they're modern or historic, without the necessary permits or credentials, which is why archaeologists kind of get that green flag. It's that barrier that they have imposed to where people aren't just willy-nilly. That is considered looting and grave robbing. But
Yep. And the penance for that is pretty hefty, given not simply the fees, but anything you ever use to come in contact with anything you loot is liable to be seized by the government. Store it in your house is repossessed. Drove your car to the place you stole it from, your car is repossessed.
yeah, so it's a very tricky subject in that regard. But yeah, I would say in the interim, it is
Yeah.
probably not the worst thing to do, but at the
Mhm.
same point, I also should acknowledge my bias, in that I am a white male archaeologist. I am not indigenous. I do not have any cultural ties, so I don't know what the best practice would be, and that's where I would just default to defer. And
Yeah.
I think that's a good
Yeah.
good
I think
assumption.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the assumption is to defer with the descendant community, especially once you find them. And for the interim, I would have to say, of the three options we seem to have presented here, I would probably rank giving them a number designation as the worst option you could give them. Then giving them an indigenous name, I think that is a great option. However, you would have to make sure that you actually knew what descendant group it was firsthand, because there might be something mildly insulting in giving, say, a Navajo man a Cherokee name. uh, so I would, and because of that, I would say a place name would be probably your best and safest option. No one is going to object to Appalachian Man when you find him in the Appalachian Mountains.
The only thing I would make sure of is there are a lot of place names that are of indigenous origin but can be an offensive term or can be problematic. Like, I can't tell you the amount of squaw mountains or squaw valleys that we have in this country. I know Joe Biden signed an executive order to change that, but squaw is an offensive term,
Yep.
as I've repeated it 3 times in this past 2 minutes. But
Yep. Yep. And it only took our government 2.5 centuries to figure that out.
shocked Pikachu face.
Yep. Yeah. Whoever said it was about the journey and not the destination was lying. It is about getting to the destination.
But it poses a very interesting question and a very interesting dilemma. I mean, one of the top comments is talk about how it happens in Europe, and in Europe they have a vastly different approach to how to handle human remains and bodies.
Oh yeah, and just to give Justin some shock value here, with this thing, I was in Greece once upon a time. I was studying there. I believe I was studying Greek theater at that time. In the subway of the city of Athens, preserved in the walls behind a glass pane in situ, which is where they found it, are several corpses on public display. And the people there in Athens and Greece are very proud of that fact. They walk by and they point to it, and that's our ancestor. That's how far back we go to this place. And it's very proud to have the skeleton of a 2,500-year-old Athenian person just in the wall.
Whereas in the United States, in our home state of Illinois, there was a wonderful, wonderful museum exhibit at Dixon Mounds, where it was a burial mound complex. And the wonderful scientists and researchers at the time, in an effort to help preserve it and to show it off, sliced off the top half of the mound and to the point where you could see burials beneath you, and they put a piece of acrylic plexiglass right across the top so you could walk over and view the bodies in the ground as it stood, until a lot of the indigenous communities went, hey, that's a little messed up. We aren't cool with that. So they finally had to change their approach.
It is polar opposite reactions and viewpoints, hanging precisely on the crutch of who is displaying this and why.
And I think a very good, important distinction between the two is it is the descendant communities, and it is what their preference is in terms of the display of the remains.
Yeah. In Athens, it is the elected government of the people of Athens choosing to do this to the remains of ancient Athenians, whereas in Illinois, it was a bunch of essentially colonists deciding to do this to a bunch of Native American remains.
Correct.
And you spot the difference. It's very important that you do. Please, in the name of God, comment below that you know what we're talking about.
As we just described, like half of the debates going on in modern archaeology, stop being racist. No. Please. No. Okay. Yeah. That's literally
Thank you, Michael Scott meme. Thank you, Michael Scott meme. Just blast that full on.
Hey,
put that in the chat if you want. If you want Justin to respond to you, he loves The Office.
Oh God, why must you torture me? Colum here, his entire life is just one giant Office reference. But on that wonderful tangent, I think is probably a good point to tie a bow on this ethical debate before we lose sight of what is true.
Yep, let's go. Let's yep.
But thank you guys for watching and checking this out. If you want to see a specific topic or want to see us react to something specific, be sure to drop a comment down below. Leave a like if you enjoyed it. It really helps us with the YouTube algorithm. And be sure to subscribe so that way you can check out all of our future content. We do these reacts every single Saturday, so it's like clockwork, baby. And we'll catch you guys next week.